Have you ever noticed how some people just can't stand seeing someone stand firm in their convictions? Now, imagine being Donald Trump, a man who, despite all the criticism, never backed down. They mocked him, laughed at him, and claimed his faith was just for show. But then, in a moment no one expected, Trump did something that changed everything. He lifted the Bible, and at that instant, something unbelievable happened. An event that even his biggest critics couldn't ignore. What happened? And why did this simple gesture cause such an uproar? Let's find out now. If you believe in leadership, power, and second chances, this is the place for you. Hit that like button, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to never miss an inspiring Trump story. From the very beginning of his public life, Donald Trump never shied away from his beliefs. While many politicians carefully crafted their words to avoid controversy, he spoke openly about his faith, his belief in God, and his conviction that America was built on Christian values. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was something deeply ingrained in the way he approached leadership, decision-making, and even the trials he faced. Yet, his faith did not come without opposition. The media, political adversaries, and cultural elites relentlessly questioned his sincerity. They dissected his every word, searching for contradictions, mocking his expressions of faith, and portraying him as a man using religion for personal gain. But Trump never wavered. During some of the most tumultuous moments of his presidency, when others might have been tempted to retreat, he did the exact opposite. Instead of backing down, he doubled down. When churches were under attack, literally and figuratively, he stood in their defense. When religious freedoms were threatened, he took decisive action. He made it clear that his faith was not just a political tool, but a core part of who he was. There were moments that defined his unwavering stance. When the world seemed to turn against him, he turned to something greater than politics, greater than power. He turned to God. Whether it was through his open calls for prayer, his insistence on protecting Christian values, or his public acts of defiance against those who sought to erase faith from American society, Trump made one thing abundantly clear. His faith was not for sale, and he would not be intimidated. His opponents expected him to falter. They believed that relentless attacks would wear him down, that he would eventually conform to the expectations of Washington, that he would become just another politician who spoke of faith only when it was convenient. But they underestimated him. And then came the moment that would change everything. A moment that would silence even his most vocal critics. A moment when, despite all the pressure, despite all the hostility, despite the overwhelming forces trying to push him into submission, Donald Trump did something that would leave the world in shock. What happened next was something no one could have predicted. There are moments in history that define a leader. Moments when the weight of a nation's struggles converges into a single decisive act that changes everything. For Donald Trump, one of those moments came at a time when America was on the brink of chaos. The streets were filled with unrest. Voices of anger echoed across the country, and the divisions within the nation seemed deeper than ever before. The air was thick with tension, a country torn between conflicting ideologies, and the world watched as the foundations of law, order, and faith were put to the test. The attacks against him had never been more relentless. Critics from every side accused him of failing to control the situation. The media painted him as weak, and even some of his allies wavered in their support. Yet, through all the noise, through all the pressure, he remained unshaken. He knew that words alone would not be enough. He needed to send a message, one that no one could ignore, one that would remind America of its roots, of its strength, of its guiding principles. Then, at the peak of the storm, he took action. While others hesitated, while the so-called experts debated, he moved with certainty. He stepped forward, not to argue, not to make excuses, but to stand as a symbol of defiance against the forces seeking to unravel the very fabric of the nation. And in his hands, he carried a symbol that had guided generations before him. He lifted the Bible, not as a prop, not as a calculated political maneuver, but as a declaration. It was a statement that cut through the chaos, a statement that resonated far beyond the immediate moment. It was a message to those who sought to erase faith from the public square, to those who believed they could intimidate a nation into submission, to those who had forgotten the power of conviction. He was reminding them all that America was, and always would be, a nation under God. The reaction was immediate. His critics were stunned, caught off guard by an act so simple yet so profound. Some tried to dismiss it, others lashed out in anger, but no one could ignore it. Across the country, millions saw what happened and felt a renewed sense of purpose. The silent majority, the people who had watched in dismay as their values were trampled, saw in that moment a leader willing to stand for what they believed in. His enemies had expected him to retreat, to cower under the immense pressure, to bow to the relentless narrative designed to break him. Instead, he stood taller than ever, holding in his hands the very foundation of the nation's moral and spiritual strength. That image, that defiant act, was etched into history. It was more than a response to a crisis. It was a turning point, and yet the battle was far from over. What happened next would send shockwaves through the political landscape, igniting a chain of events that no one could have foreseen. The question was no longer whether Trump could withstand the storm. The question was, how would his opponents respond now that they realized he was never going to back down? The moment Donald Trump lifted the Bible, a wave of emotion surged across the nation. For his supporters, particularly those of faith, this was not just an act of symbolism. It was a declaration, a reminder that even in the face of relentless opposition, faith would not be erased, and the values that had shaped America would not be surrendered. For years, Christians across the country had felt increasingly marginalized. Their beliefs were mocked, their traditions questioned, their voices silenced in the name of political correctness. They watched as the foundations of morality and spirituality that had guided generations were systematically dismantled. It seemed as though the very idea of faith in the public sphere had become something controversial, something that was to be hidden rather than embraced. And yet, in a single moment, Trump defied that entire narrative. Churches erupted in applause. Congregations that had felt abandoned by leaders who wavered in the face of cultural pressure suddenly felt a renewed sense of purpose. Pastors spoke from their pulpits, calling the moment a divine reminder that their faith was not meant to be passive but bold. Across the country, millions of believers who had once felt like a silent majority realized they were not alone. Messages of support poured in from every direction. Some called it an act of courage, others a fulfillment of something greater than politics. Families gathered, parents told their children to remember this moment, to understand that faith was not something to be hidden in the shadows. In small towns and big cities alike, people who had felt powerless against the growing tide of secularism saw in Trump's defiant act a rallying cry. But this was more than just a moment of encouragement. This was a moment that ignited something deeper. It was as if a veil had been lifted, as if people had been waiting for a sign, waiting for a leader who would not cower when challenged on the very principles that defined the country. They saw in Trump's action not just a president, but a warrior for values they held sacred. Even those who had not always agreed with his methods began to reconsider. They saw the relentless attacks against him, the mockery from the media, the attempts to paint him as insincere, and they asked themselves why. Why was it so offensive for a leader to hold up a Bible? Why did this single gesture cause such an uproar? The more they thought about it, the clearer the answer became. Because it was never just about Trump. It was about what he represented. And yet, as powerful as the moment was, it was not without consequence. The backlash was swift, and those who opposed him were more determined than ever to tear him down. What came next would test the strength of his supporters, the resilience of the movement, and the very future of the battle between faith and those who sought to erase it. The question now was, would the people stand firm, or would the relentless forces of opposition break their resolve? Throughout history, the greatest leaders have been defined not only by their strength and vision, but by something even deeper, their unwavering faith in a higher purpose. For Donald Trump, faith was never just a personal belief or a political talking point. It was a foundation, a guiding force that shaped the way he led, the way he fought, and the way he endured even the most relentless storms. From the moment he stepped into the political arena, he was met with forces determined to break him. The attacks were not just political, they were deeply personal, designed to dismantle his character, his resilience, and his ability to lead. Yet time and time again, he emerged stronger, and those who watched closely understood why. He was not navigating the chaos alone. He leaned on something greater than himself, something that had guided leaders before him, something that gave him the clarity to push forward even when the entire world seemed determined to see him fail. His enemies expected him to crumble under pressure. They believed that no man could withstand the level of scrutiny, opposition, and betrayal that he faced daily. But they underestimated the force behind his resolve. When the attacks intensified, he did not retreat. When obstacles seemed insurmountable, he did not surrender. Instead, he stood firm, unwavering in his mission, drawing strength from the one source that had never abandoned him, his faith. Those closest to him knew that his most important decisions were not made in isolation. He sought counsel, not just from advisors and experts, but from men and women of deep spiritual wisdom. He understood that leadership was more than policies and power. It was about something far greater. It was about standing in the face of adversity, about defending what was right even when it was unpopular, about understanding that the battles he fought were not just political but spiritual. There were moments when even his supporters questioned how he continued. The relentless pressure, the media's ceaseless war against him, the betrayals from those who once stood beside him. Any other leader would have folded under the weight. But Trump pressed on, not because the path was easy, but because he believed it was necessary. He knew that what he stood for was bigger than himself, bigger than any election, bigger than any headline. He was carrying a fight that had existed long before him and would continue long after. His faith was not performative. It was not a temporary shield against criticism. It was the very core of his endurance, the reason he never lost sight of the mission. He understood that true leadership required something more than intellect or strategy. It required conviction, a belief that no matter how fierce the opposition, no matter how deep the struggle, victory would come to those who stood firmly in truth. And yet, for all the strength that faith gave him, it also made him a greater target. Those who sought to dismantle everything he stood for realized that if they wanted to defeat him, they had to attack not just the man, but the very foundation that kept him standing. They launched a new wave of opposition, one that was more ruthless than anything before. The battle had only begun, and now, more than ever, the forces against him were determined to silence him once and for all. But what they failed to understand was that a leader whose strength comes from faith does not break. He only grows stronger, and what came next would prove that the fight was far from over. From the very beginning of his presidency, Donald Trump faced challenges that seemed insurmountable. The political establishment, the media, and even some within his own party doubted his ability to govern. Yet, against all odds, his administration saw achievements that even his harshest critics struggled to explain. Time and time again, when it appeared that forces were aligning against him, events unfolded in ways that defied expectations. For many, these moments were not just strokes of luck or political maneuvering. They were seen as evidence of divine intervention, miracles that reshaped the course of history. One of the most significant moments came early in his presidency, when the economy, once stagnant and burdened by failed policies, began to surge at an unprecedented rate. Experts had warned that reversing years of economic decline would take decades, yet within months, the country saw record-breaking job growth, soaring markets, and a revival of industries that had long been declared dead. Critics scrambled to explain how such a turnaround was even possible. The answer, for millions of believers, was clear. This was the hand of God guiding a leader who had been chosen to restore strength to a nation that had been on the brink of economic despair. Then came the moments of crisis, times when the world expected his leadership to fail. International tensions escalated, and enemies of the United States prepared to challenge the new administration. The world braced for war, anticipating conflicts that had been brewing for years to finally reach a boiling point. Yet, miraculously, peace was secured in ways that defied conventional wisdom. Nations that had been locked in hostility extended their hands in negotiation. Political analysts who had once predicted disaster were left speechless as Trump brokered agreements that no other leader before him had been able to achieve. Many saw these moments as nothing short of divine orchestration, proof that his presidency was not just another chapter in history, but a mission guided by something greater. Beyond politics, there were the stories that could not be ignored. The countless reports of individuals who claimed their prayers had been answered through his policies. Families that had been given new opportunities, communities that had been revitalized, and a sense of hope that had long been missing from American life. His actions were not just changing policies, they were changing lives in ways that many believed could only be attributed to divine favor. There were also moments when disaster loomed, when it seemed as though chaos would consume everything. Hurricanes, pandemics, threats of economic collapse. Each time, the opposition waited for failure, certain that his administration would finally succumb to the weight of crisis. Yet again, something unexplainable happened. Each challenge was met with resilience, each catastrophe averted or mitigated in ways that defied the grim predictions of experts. The survival of his presidency through these trials became for many yet another sign that he was being protected by a force greater than any political institution or media attack. And then there was the spiritual revival that followed. Across the nation, churches began to see renewed energy. Leaders of faith who had once remained silent found their voices again, inspired by the strength they saw in him. He was not just leading a political movement, he was awakening something deeper in the hearts of millions. He was proving that faith was not meant to be passive, that belief was not meant to be hidden, and that the values upon which America was founded were not relics of the past, but the key to its future. Even as his opponents dismissed these events as coincidence, those who had faith saw something else. They saw a leader who had been placed in power for a reason. They saw miracles happening before their very eyes, miracles that no amount of media spin or political rhetoric could erase. They knew that this was not just about one man, one presidency, or even one nation. It was about a battle between those who sought to strip the world of faith and those who stood ready to defend it. And yet, as undeniable as these moments were, the fight was far from over. If history had proven anything, it was that those who stood for truth and faith would always be met with fierce resistance. What lay ahead would test not just Trump's resolve, but the resolve of an entire movement. The question was no longer whether miracles had happened. It was whether those who witnessed them would have the courage to stand and fight for what they believed in before it was too late. From the very beginning of his presidency, Donald Trump understood that the battles he faced were not just political, but spiritual. Unlike other leaders who viewed faith as a private matter, something to be mentioned in passing, but rarely acted upon, he saw it as an essential force, one that had shaped the very foundation of the nation he now led. He knew that no matter how strong his policies, how determined his actions, or how strategic his decisions, there was something greater than politics guiding the fate of America. And in the moments when the country stood at the brink of uncertainty, he did something that few leaders before him had dared to do. He called upon the American people to pray. At a time when the nation was more divided than ever, his opponents dismissed the idea of prayer as outdated, ineffective, even laughable. They believed that America had moved past the need for such things, that reliance on faith was a sign of weakness rather than strength. But Trump saw things differently. He knew that throughout history, the most powerful movements, the most unbreakable people, and the most unstoppable forces had one thing in common. They believed in something greater than themselves. His first major call to prayer came during a time of great crisis. A devastating hurricane had swept through the country, leaving destruction in its wake. Entire communities were left in ruins, families were displaced, and the weight of despair loomed over the nation. The media focused on the damage, on the failures, on the politics of disaster response. But Trump did something unexpected. He turned the nation's focus towards something that could not be destroyed: faith. He stood before the people and urged them to pray, not just for recovery, but for unity, for strength, for the kind of resilience that could only come from believing that even in the darkest times, hope was never lost. What followed was unlike anything seen in modern history. Across the nation, millions answered the call. Churches opened their doors. Communities gathered. Strangers joined hands in prayer. It was as if something deep within the soul of the nation had been reignited. People who had long felt disconnected from the government suddenly felt heard, as if their faith was not just being acknowledged, but embraced by the highest office in the land. But it did not stop there. Again and again, in moments when the nation faced uncertainty, Trump turned not to empty rhetoric, but to faith. Whether it was in the face of political attacks, economic downturns, global conflicts, or national tragedies, he never hesitated to remind the people that America had always been a nation that sought guidance from above. He welcomed pastors and spiritual leaders into the White House, not for publicity, but because he believed their wisdom and prayers carried a power that no policy or legislation could match. Donald Trump's journey is filled with resilience, bold decisions, and unforgettable moments. Stay inspired. Like this video, drop a comment below, and subscribe to be part of this movement. His unwavering stance on the importance of prayer sent a clear message, not just to his supporters, but to his critics as well. It showed that in a world where moral compromise was the norm, where leaders bowed to political correctness and feared offending the powerful forces pushing against faith, he would not waver. He was not ashamed to call upon God, and he was not afraid to remind the nation that without divine guidance, even the greatest empires would crumble. The movement he sparked went beyond politics. It became a revival of something deeper, something that had been dormant for too long. Suddenly, faith was no longer something to be hidden. It was something to be embraced, celebrated, and defended. People who had once felt isolated in their beliefs found strength in numbers, realizing they were not alone. They were part of something greater, a movement that was not just political, but spiritual. Yet, as history had proven time and time again, such a movement would not go unchallenged. Those who sought to erase faith from the public square saw the power that prayer had unleashed, and they knew they had to act. What came next was a level of resistance unlike anything seen before. The attacks grew more vicious, the opposition more determined, and the forces working against him more desperate. The battle for the soul of the nation was far from over. And as the storm intensified, one question remained. Would the people continue to stand in faith, or would they allow the forces of darkness to silence them once and for all? From the moment Donald Trump stepped onto the political stage, the media launched an unrelenting campaign against him. They dissected every word he spoke, twisted every statement, and worked tirelessly to craft a narrative that would undermine his leadership. But there was one aspect of his presidency that they were particularly desperate to discredit: his faith. They mocked it, dismissed it as performative, and did everything in their power to convince the public that his belief in God was nothing more than a political strategy. Yet no matter how many headlines they printed, no matter how many experts they paraded on television, the people saw the truth. Trump never conformed to the expectations of Washington, and that defiance extended to his approach to faith. While other politicians carefully curated their religious image to fit within the boundaries of acceptability, he refused to play by those rules. He spoke of God not with rehearsed platitudes, but with conviction. He defended Christian values not because it was politically convenient, but because he believed they were essential to the survival of the nation. He openly declared that America was a country built on faith, a truth that generations before him had accepted as fundamental, but that modern leaders feared acknowledging. The media, however, could not tolerate this. They ridiculed his calls for prayer, dismissed his moments of spiritual reflection, and sought to convince the world that he was an imposter, a man using faith as a shield rather than a source of strength. They painted him as a hypocrite, an opportunist, someone who invoked God only when it suited him. But for all their efforts, they could not erase the reality that millions of Americans witnessed with their own eyes. The people saw a leader who, despite the relentless attacks, never backed down from his beliefs. They saw a president who welcomed pastors into the White House, who prayed before making decisions that would shape the future of the nation, who stood against the forces that sought to strip faith from the public square. They saw a man who did not cater to the elite's expectations of religious expression, but instead embraced faith as something real, something unshakable, something that could not be dictated by polls or approval ratings. In churches across the country, congregations gathered to pray for him, knowing that his fight was not just political but spiritual. Families sat together at their dinner tables, discussing the way the media tried to manipulate them, knowing that the truth could not be hidden forever. The more the media attacked his faith, the more the people recognized the pattern. They had seen it before, how the institutions of power always sought to silence those who stood for truth. They knew that the louder the opposition became, the more they were trying to suppress. Something real, something that could not be controlled. His critics expected him to grow weary under the weight of their constant assaults. They believed that if they ridiculed him enough, he would retreat, that he would stop speaking so openly about God, that he would tone down his defense of faith to avoid further backlash. But they did not understand him. He thrived under pressure, stood stronger in the face of adversity, and refused to compromise on what he believed. Every attack only fueled his determination. Every smear campaign only proved what he had said all along, that the battle was bigger than politics. And so, the divide between the media and the people only grew. One side clung to its desperate attempts to control the narrative, while the other refused to be deceived. The media could manipulate headlines, but they could not manipulate the faith that burned in the hearts of millions. They could dismiss Trump's words, but they could not dismiss the fact that churches were filling with believers who felt more emboldened than ever. They could ignore the movement he had ignited, but they could not stop it. Yet, for all their failures, they were not done fighting. If they could not destroy his faith, they would try to destroy him. What came next was an escalation unlike anything seen before, a direct assault on his character, his legacy, and everything he had built. The question was no longer whether the people saw through the lies. The question was whether they were prepared for the next battle that was about to begin. Donald Trump's unapologetic embrace of faith was something that the secular establishment never expected. From the moment he took office, he made it clear that belief in God was not something to be hidden, softened, or diluted for the sake of political correctness. He spoke about faith not as a passive tradition, but as a source of strength, a foundation for leadership, and a guiding force in the destiny of a nation. His conviction was so unshakable that even those who had spent their lives rejecting the idea of divine intervention began to take notice. For years, atheists and secularists had been conditioned to view religion as outdated, a relic of a past where faith dictated decisions instead of logic and reason. Many of them saw political leaders who used religion as a mere backdrop, a tool to win votes, something to be mentioned during campaigns and discarded when the cameras were off. But Trump was different. He did not simply acknowledge faith. He wielded it like a weapon, an immovable pillar that no scandal, no attack, no media narrative could weaken. And that, more than anything, confused those who had long dismissed belief in God as nothing more than an illusion. At first, many of his staunchest critics mocked him. They called his expressions of faith insincere, ridiculed his statements about God's role in his presidency, and scoffed at the idea that divine providence had any place in government. Yet, as time went on, something unexpected happened. They saw a man who endured endless political warfare, yet never broke. They saw how every attempt to humiliate him, to wear him down, to push him into submission, failed time and time again. He did not just survive these attacks. He emerged from them stronger, more determined, and with an even greater sense of purpose. This forced many to ask the question they had long avoided. Was there something more to faith than they had believed? Could it be that the strength they had attributed to stubbornness was actually rooted in something deeper, something beyond human will? They had seen politicians fall before, their careers and legacies destroyed by scandals, betrayals, and the pressures of power. But Trump was different. He had faced an unprecedented level of resistance, yet he never wavered. He spoke about faith not as a vague, comforting notion, but as the very thing that had carried him through the storm. Some of his most vocal opponents found themselves re-evaluating their views. They began reading about the power of faith, not because they wanted to support him, but because they wanted to understand how a man could withstand so much and still press forward with such certainty. Many of them, for the first time, questioned the rigid beliefs they had held for so long. If faith was nothing more than an illusion, why did it seem to be the one thing that the most powerful institutions in the world could not defeat? Among them were those who had once been dedicated to tearing him down, activists who had spent years trying to erase religion from public life, commentators who had built their careers on ridiculing those who believed in God. Slowly, quietly, some of them began to change. They would never admit it publicly, but their perspective had shifted. They saw that faith was not a weakness as they had been taught, but a force unlike anything they had ever encountered. Every great leader leaves a legacy. Be part of the conversation. Smash that like button, share your opinion in the comments, and make sure to subscribe for more powerful Trump insights. What unnerved them the most was not just Trump's resilience, but the fact that millions of people saw in him a reflection of their own struggles. He had become more than a leader. He had become a symbol of defiance, a living example that faith was still alive, that it could not be erased, no matter how hard the world tried. Even those who still rejected the idea of God had to acknowledge one undeniable truth. There was something about Trump's unwavering belief that made him indestructible in ways they could not explain. And yet, as more people began to open their eyes to the power of faith, those who sought to destroy it only grew more desperate. They realized that their attempts to discredit him had backfired, that they had not weakened his movement but strengthened it. What they did next would be their most ruthless attack yet, an effort to erase not just his influence, but the very faith that had given his movement life. The battle was far from over, and the next phase would determine whether the resurgence of belief that Trump had ignited would continue to grow, or whether the forces against him would finally find a way to silence it once and for all. Throughout history, great leaders have risen in times of turmoil, often defying the expectations of their era and reshaping the course of their nations. Their rise is rarely understood in the moment, but looking back, patterns emerge, and events that once seemed coincidental begin to appear as something more, something guided by a force beyond human comprehension. Donald Trump's leadership, marked by resilience, defiance, and an unshakable belief in divine purpose, led many to ask a question that had once been reserved for ancient kings and biblical warriors. Was his rise part of a prophecy? From the moment he announced his candidacy, his journey defied all predictions. The media dismissed him, the political establishment ridiculed him, and even those within his own party underestimated him. Yet with every obstacle placed before him, he grew stronger. The attacks against him were relentless, unlike anything any modern leader had faced, yet he refused to be broken. He spoke with the conviction of a man who believed his mission was greater than politics, greater than power, greater than himself. Those who studied history and scripture could not ignore the parallels, outsiders chosen at the most unexpected moments, men who stood against the most powerful empires of their time, guided not by human strategy, but by something unseen. Religious scholars and spiritual leaders began to take notice. They spoke of the timing, of the way he emerged when America seemed to be losing its way, when faith was under attack, when the very foundations of the nation were being eroded. They pointed to the leaders of the past, figures who had been mocked, despised, and underestimated, yet who had been used to bring about profound change. Many began to believe that his presidency, his struggles, and his defiance of every attempt to silence him were not mere coincidences, but part of a larger narrative, a fulfillment of something foretold. There were those who looked to ancient texts, searching for patterns, symbols, and signs. They spoke of leaders who were called upon not because they were perfect, but because they were willing. They recalled figures who had been thrown into the heart of political storms, not by choice, but by destiny. Men who had been attacked, betrayed, and opposed on all sides, yet had prevailed because they understood that their mission was greater than their personal trials. The comparisons were undeniable. Even among those who did not believe in prophecy, there was an undeniable recognition that Trump's impact was unlike anything seen before. His connection with the people, his ability to ignite a movement that defied every conventional rule of politics, and his unwavering commitment to faith suggested that he was playing a role far greater than even he might have imagined. His leadership had not only revived a sense of national pride, but it had also rekindled something deeper, a belief that America's future was not yet written, that its decline was not inevitable, and that its founding principles were not relics of the past, but the keys to its resurgence. And yet, the question remained, what came next? If his rise had been foretold, what did that mean for the battles still ahead? His enemies were not finished. The forces that had sought to destroy him once would return stronger, more determined, more ruthless than before. They had seen his resilience. They had witnessed his ability to endure what no other leader had endured, and they knew that their only option was total destruction. The attacks that would follow would not just target him. They would target the movement he had built, the faith he had reignited, the people who had placed their hope in him. But those who believed in something greater understood one thing: the story was not over. If history had proven anything, it was that when a leader stands with conviction, when he refuses to bow, when he embraces the purpose placed before him, the battle does not end in defeat. It ends in victory. And if Trump's leadership was indeed part of a greater plan, then the greatest chapters of his story and the story of the nation he fought to restore were still waiting to be written. Donald Trump's journey was never just about politics. It was about something far greater, a battle between those who sought to erase the foundations of faith, tradition, and national pride, and those who believed that America's destiny was not one of decline but of renewal. Through every challenge, every attack, and every moment of doubt, he never wavered. He stood firm in his convictions, defying the forces that tried to silence him, and in doing so, he ignited something far beyond a political movement. He awakened a spirit that had been lying dormant, a belief that no matter how powerful the opposition, no matter how overwhelming the odds, truth and faith would always prevail. When he lifted the Bible, it was more than a simple gesture. It was a declaration, a moment in history that transcended politics. It sent a message to those who had lost hope, to those who had been told that faith no longer had a place in the modern world, to those who had been made to feel as though their values were relics of the past. That moment was a reminder that belief is not weakness, that conviction is not outdated, and that a leader who refuses to bow to pressure can inspire millions to stand alongside him. The establishment tried to destroy him. The media tried to discredit him. The political elites, the cultural forces, the power-hungry bureaucracies, all of them worked tirelessly to erase his influence, to break his spirit, to convince the world that he was finished. But they failed, because Trump was never just a politician. He was never just a president. He became a symbol of defiance, of resilience, of a nation that refuses to be controlled. His story is not over. The battles he fought were not for himself, but for the millions who saw in him a leader willing to take on the impossible. And now, that responsibility does not rest on his shoulders alone. It belongs to everyone who believes in what he stood for, to those who refuse to be silenced, to those who will not allow history to be rewritten by those who seek to erase faith and freedom, to those who know that America's greatest days are not behind it, but ahead. The question now is not whether Trump's leadership changed history. The question is whether the people he inspired will rise to defend what he fought for, whether they will stand against those who seek to undo everything that has been built, whether they will carry forward the movement that was never about one man, but about a nation reclaiming its destiny. The battle is far from over, but history has shown time and again that when the people stand together, when they refuse to back down, when they hold firm to their beliefs, nothing is impossible. So now, the call is clear. Share this story, speak the truth, stand for what is right, because the fight for America's future is only just beginning. And as long as there are those willing to stand, the light of faith, freedom, and truth will never be extinguished. Strength, strategy, and vision. If these qualities inspire you, you're in the right place. Show your support by liking this video, commenting your thoughts, and subscribing for more.